Good afternoon, Keith Tebow from FRCMedia. Thank you for joining us today. Another one of the co-defendants in the trial of former Fall River Mayor Jasiel Correia was sentenced today. Hildegar Camara, who was charged on 6 counts of extortion, conspiracy, and making false statements, who pled guilty to those charges, was before Judge Douglas Woodlock today in U.S. District Court in Boston. And he was sentenced today, similar to Tony Costa, who was sentenced last month. He's not going to be getting any jail time. I'm joined right now by attorney Steve Sabra, who has joined us on many occasions to talk about the sentence and what it may mean moving forward. Attorney Sabra, thank you for joining me. How are you today?
I'm good, Keith. Thank you.
So the rundown for Mr. Camara is in some ways very similar to Antonio Costa. Mr. Camara will not be serving any jail time, despite the prosecution's recommendation that he do serve some jail time. Judge Douglas Woodlock today has sentenced Mr. Camara to 3 years of probation, 18 months of home confinement, where he'll be allowed to attend to any work commitments, any medical commitments, and any religious services he'd like to attend. He's also going to be asked to take part in 150 hours per year of those 3 years of local community service. He will not be issued any fine or any forfeiture as compared to Mr. Costa. So, Attorney Sabra, let me just get your first snap judgment on this sentence today.
Well, I think the first thing is the defense had recommended essentially the sentence that Judge Woodlock imposed, because this case was a little different than Tony Costa's case. Remember, in Tony Costa's case, as I recall, both the prosecution and the defense had an agreed recommendation, and the judge essentially went along with that recommendation. This case with Mr. Camara was a little bit different in that the prosecution had recommended 3 months of incarceration, and the defense had recommended a year and a half, 18 months of home confinement. So essentially what the judge did went along with the defense recommendation, which was three years probation, 18 months of that to be served in home confinement. And there wasn't any monetary penalty like in Mr. Costa's case, because remember, in Mr. Costa's case, he had personally benefited in this scheme and had taken a certain amount of money, and that's what Judge Woodlock had assessed as to be forfeited, and it was in the neighborhood of $107,000 plus Mr. Costa got a $10,000 fine as well. And the other important point that the defense raised, and I would think that the judge considered, was despite the fact that Mr. Camara was a public official, his crimes did not involve that public job that he had. So that's kind of important, I think, going forward, because remember, we still have 3 other people that have their cases not completely resolved. You have Jasiel Correia being sentenced in September, and you have Jen Andrade, who is, I guess, pending trial or some type of agreement with the prosecution, and that's sort of up in the air. And then you have another defendant that's to be sentenced, I believe, in October. And so, to me, what I thought was important was some of the comments Judge Woodlock made about this whole scheme with regard to the marijuana, and I think that's what he was referring to, where he said it was shocking. That's how he described the scheme, and he talked about he mentioned about Mr. Costa and his activities being extremely serious, and he also didn't. He commented on Mr. Camara too, where his defense attorney said, well, he tried to give back the money and he didn't want to get involved with the money. And Judge Woodlock kind of cut him off and said, well, what he didn't want is his fingerprints on the money. And so the important, I think, takeaway from the judge's comments and the sentencing is that with regard to Mr. Correia and Jen Andrade, their situation's a lot different. They didn't cooperate. They're both public officials. Jasiel Correia has been convicted of 21 out of 24 charges. So their cases, I think are going to be different. Certainly, it's obvious. Mr. Correia's case is going to be different. What's up in the air, so to speak, is Jen Andrade's case. But from the judge's comments about this scheme with regard to the marijuana, and emphasizing that although Mr. Camara was a public official, the crimes didn't involve his duties as that public official, whereas with Mr. Correia and Jen Andrade, they do. So I think going forward, that'll be something to keep in mind.
Yeah, it was interesting. In the portions I watched of the sentencing, Judge Woodlock did mention that the charges against Mr. Camara, were jailable offenses, if you will, that there should be prison time under normal circumstances. And he mentioned again today, as he did with Mr. Costa, and the government did as well, the prosecutors, about Mr. Camara, quote unquote, doing the right thing. Coming forward, helping the prosecution in its case against the former mayor. And, I guess, Steve, my next question for you would be, it's interesting how judges in general look at sentencing. When I first heard Judge Woodlock say that these are, jailable offenses, or whatever terms he used, I thought that would lend to believe that there would be some prison time here for Mr. Camara. And then, that all turned around. So I guess talk a little bit about how judges, they do have a lot of leeway and a lot of flexibility, and how, circumstances are different in each case.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Keith, that you mentioned, because that plays into this idea of mandatory sentencing. That there was a time not that long ago where there was a big push for mandatory sentencing, and that essentially ties the judge's hands, and it puts the sentencing really in control of the prosecution by what they charge. So what judges consider in sentencing is a whole host of factors, which was mentioned in the proceedings today, about whether or not the defendant has any kind of prior history, meaning any kind of prior criminal offenses. Have they profited? Are they a public official? What are the charges? And the judge mentioned about the sentencing guidelines. So in the federal system, you have these sentencing guidelines, but they're only guidelines. So you have them in the state system as well. And for example, in Mr. Costa's case and Mr. Camara's case, I believe the sentencing guidelines call for a sentence between 5 and 6 years in prison, but the judge doesn't have to go along with that recommendation. That comes from the pre-sentence report, and it's kind of formula. It's basically arithmetic, which is what the words that Judge Woodlock used when it comes to these sentencing guidelines. So you plug in things like what are the charges? Is there any history? How old is the defendant? Those types of things. So sentencing is one of those things that probably is the hardest part of a job as a judge, because you do have this flexibility, and you're trying to do a couple of things in sentencing. You want to deter people from doing a similar crime. You of course want to punish, but you also want to be fair, and you want hope that the person is remorseful and can rehabilitate themselves and go on to be a contributing member of society. And I think those are some of the things that the judge was thinking about in sentencing.
Yeah. And you mentioned, how, the case of Mr. Costa and the case of Mr. Camara are different from the other three defendants, of course, former Mayor Correia, Jan Andrade, and David Hebert, who had his sentencing, which was supposed to be last week. That's been pushed off until October. And, I would expect that we'll see different types of sentencing. Of course, with Ms. Andrade, there may not be any sentencing right away. There could be a trial. There could be another plea agreement. But that'll be, I think, a different situation when we get to that point. And the first time we'll see that is we'll see with Mayor Correia, right now scheduled for September 20th. So, Attorney Steve Sabra, I appreciate your time as always, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Keith.
All right. And thank you for joining us today here on FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. Have a great day.